Buenas noches a todos, todas y todes. Desde la Cátedra UNESCO, Igualdad y Género de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, les agradecemos por participar de las clases magistrales. Hoy tendremos la tercera y última conferencia titulada Rethinking Trans Politics, Rethinking Trans Theory. A partir de ahora voy a hablar en inglés, pero para todas las personas que quisieran escuchar en español, en el Zoom, en la parte de abajo, hay como un mundo donde dice Translation, y ahí Interpretation, ahí pueden hacer clic y poner en el idioma en el que quieren escuchar. Entonces, si quieren escuchar en español, ponen español y abajo ponen Mute Original Audio. Entonces, de esa manera escuchan solamente al intérprete. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the UNESCO-PUCP lectures on gender equality, and a special thank you to Professor Bettcher for being here with us for the third time. We are extremely excited and grateful and privileged. Today we have, like I said, the third lecture, and it's the final lecture called Rethinking Trans Politics, Rethinking Trans Theory. Talia Bettcher is a professor of philosophy at California State University, LA. Some of her articles include Evil Deceivers and Make-Believers, Transphobic Violence and the Politics of Illusion, Trapped in the Wrong Theory, Rethinking Trans Oppression and Resistance, and What is Trans Philosophy? She is currently completing the monograph Intimacy and Illusion, an essay in trans philosophy. So before we start, I just want to say that if you have any questions during the lecture, you can write them on the chat, and I will read them after the lecture is finished. If you prefer to write them in Spanish, that's not a problem because I can translate them for Professor Bettcher. So with that said, I want to welcome Professor Bettcher and thanks everyone for being here today again.
Gracias, Aranza. Buenas tardes. I'm going to share a screen and we'll get going. Okay, so as Aranza was saying, this is the third of 3 talks. Oops. So let me just sort of, again, give an overview. The talk series is about trans oppression. And specifically, I've been focusing on what I call reality enforcement. So the first talk was an introduction. Last time, we focused a lot on thinking about the intermeshing of multiple forms of oppression. And we talked specifically about trans prostitution. My goal had also been to introduce what I like to call my own theoretical framework, but the conversation went so long, I didn't get a chance to get to it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the framework that I'm proposing. And then I'm going to outline some consequences for trans theory and politics. So this is the order of business for today. First, there will be a brief review. Then I want to sort of outline the way that I'm thinking about it. And then I'm going to talk about 2, I guess, trans accounts or theories that are very different. One I like to call the wrong body account. The other I like to call the beyond the binary account. And then I'd like to conclude by thinking about decolonial theory and what I call the coloniality of intimacy. If we have time, because I know that there was interest last time, if we have time, we can revisit some of the discussion on trans prostitution. It actually follows nicely after the discussion of coloniality of intimacy. I fear, however, based on how things have gone, because I'm kind of a big mouth and I keep rambling on, we may not get to it. Okay, so first, reality enforcement. I've said that there are these important characteristics of it that I'll just outline again for you. So there is misgendering. So as part of reality enforcement, recall, I think that misgendering is a broader notion. So not all forms of misgendering are forms of reality enforcement. Reality enforcement, I think, also has what I call an appearance reality contrast that pertains directly to public gender presentation and presumed sex. So we have claim or expressions such as, was discovered to really be a man disguised as a woman, or was discovered to be really a woman disguised as a man. So this is the appearance reality contrast appearing to be one thing, in reality the other. And this appearance reality contrast constitutes the double bind of, on the one hand, passing as non-trans, not telling anyone that you are trans if you can do this, and then possibly subsequently being exposed later on, in which case you are viewed as deceiving someone. On the other hand, you can come out or just be out, you go, hey, I'm trans, in which case you're viewed as merely pretending, doing role play or make-believe. I've also emphasized this idea of genital verification. And this happens sort of in very extreme cases, particularly around homicides that are informed by reality enforcement. So I'm thinking about cases in which trans people literally have their genitals grabbed or are visually exposed. But I see genital verification also taking kind of discursive verbal forms when someone asks euphemistic or coded questions like, have you had this surgery or not? It's typically a question about what is between your legs. Finally, I've been thinking about what I call relational foreclosure, and that is this idea that it may appear, so if you come out as trans, it may appear that you are accepted, but in reality, you are not. Because what ends up happening is other people end up just playing along. So this is a variant of the pretender or make-believer side of the double bind. If they play along, and you don't know that they're merely playing along until later on, during these sort of cases in which, hold me back up a little bit. So someone's pretending that they're a brain surgeon. That's all fun and games. You can pretend to be a brain surgeon, but don't actually operate on someone. That's taking it too far. The pretense, right, has its limits. You can only pretend so far. And so what we see in relational foreclosure is that there are ways in which trans people are seen as taking their make-believe too far. And that's when you realize that the person who you thought was accepting your identity really doesn't accept your identity, because it turns out they believe that you are pretending. Okay. I'm going to quickly skip through this. I think that reality enforcement is it's not the only form of trans oppression, but I think it's really super important, and it informs the lives of a lot of trans people. Okay. So now it's going to get heavy. Now we're going to get theoretical. And here's the good news. It requires no background, because this is all just theory that I have spun myself. It's philosophical theory, and philosophical theory, I don't know how many of you are philosophers here, but philosophy has this tendency of sort of like giving this weird twist, like, huh, that's strange. And so some of the things that I'm going to argue for when I talk about this theory has that effect. And I think that what I have to say is interesting, but I think it's also intuitive. It will kind of make sense. And it's the framework that I use for understanding reality enforcement. Okay, so I call this theory interpersonal spatiality theory. So I'm going to start explaining some of the concepts of what I have in mind when I speak about interpersonal spatiality. So interpersonal spatiality is this idea that when we see each other, when we access each other sensorially, as right now, you can access me visually, and also when we access each other discursively through words, that we can access each other in close ways, that is, be intimate, or we can be distant, right? And the way that I understand this closeness or intimacy and distance is in terms of boundaries that govern our access to each other. So boundaries on how we look at each other, how we talk to each other, how far away we stand from each other, how we touch each other, whether we touch each other. I mean, think about the fact, so suppose that you are out and there's a stranger across the street, right? It is rude. You wouldn't just stare at this person or they're going to get mad. They'll feel uncomfortable. There's boundaries where, I mean, you could stare at a tree all you want to, but people, when we access each other, there's boundaries and that say, no, you can't look at the stranger, or only look at the corner of your eye. Or when you're talking to your friend, right, there are certain areas that you shouldn't look. So for example, and this is going to sound really crass, but like if you're talking to someone and you're staring at their breasts or you're staring at their genitals, that's rude. It's considered a boundary transgression, a violation. So my idea is that in order to make sense of interpersonal spatiality, its closeness and its distance, we need to think about these boundaries governing our sensory and discursive access that can either be observed, that is, we respect the boundaries, we don't cross them, or we do cross them in cases in which it's okay, or they're violated. So I'm thinking that sometimes when you cross a boundary, it's not bad. Sometimes when you cross a boundary, it's acceptable. It's not a violation. And in those cases, when the boundary is traversed, this is intimacy, properly speaking. This is the kind of closeness that tends to be viewed as good as occurring between two people. So hopefully that makes some sense. Okay, so now I think about these boundaries as being organized into larger, I call them tracks, like a train track. And we'll talk about this in a minute, things that are smaller than tracks I call strips. They're like mini tracks. Here's an example of what I mean. So if we think about standard heterosexual sort of sexual intimacy, it tends to follow a certain pattern, a prescribed pattern, where we have boundaries on access that are ordered, going from least to most serious, most important or weighty. And they're also ordered temporally. So the idea is first you cross this boundary, then you cross that boundary, then you cross that boundary. So let me give you some specifics, right? It might be, well, at first, you hold hands, and so there's a crossing of a boundary. And then maybe then what happens is there's a closed mouth kiss. And so again, that's increasing sensory access. The boundary becomes more serious. Then perhaps there's touching, right? And there could eventually be touching in private places. Now we're going across boundaries more, right? And it progresses on like that. But the point is, you go from increasingly serious boundaries. And the idea is that these are kind of arranged like steps. And of course, in heterosexual sexuality, coitus or penis vagina penetration is set as the sort of end, as sort of the last part of the track. So when I think about tracks, I think about these boundaries ordered about how they're crossed, sort of starting from the least weighty to the most weighty. Okay, and I'll maybe be able to explain the notion of a strip, which is like a track, better a little bit later, but I'll try it now. A strip is like a track, only it has only to do with sensory access to one being. So think about it this way, right? There are parts of a person that it's okay to access, like, you know, people show off their hands typically and their faces, right? At least in Western nations, you know, Islamic religion, it can be different, but like, so those things are exposed. But then you think that there's an increasing visual access where certain body parts are subject to boundaries where we increase this, right? So by a strip, I mean, it's like a track, it's an ordering of boundaries, but it pertains only to one unity or being or specific individual. And so when I think about, instead of talking about people, I use this fancy expression, interpersonal object, basically to suggest that we're thinking in terms of boundaries on access. I think about interpersonal objects as defined by boundaries and strips, right? So that sort of an ordering of boundaries that determine a single individual. Okay. Don't worry, I know this is pretty theoretical at this point. It's going to start to get more specific very shortly. Let me just sort of mention sort of the final crucial detail of this sort of abstract framework, and that is there are different boundary systems. Like, this is obvious. Different cultures have different boundary systems. Like, you know, in some cultures, you know, you stand really close together, even if you don't know each other, it's okay, right? In some cultures, you kiss each other on the cheek, everyone does, as a way of greeting, right? In other cultures, no. So it depends. It varies widely. But the idea that I want to suggest is that intimacy and distance are both possible because we have some boundaries, because there is some system or other that does what it does. Not this system is necessary, or that system, or any particular one given system is the right system. No, there's no one right system. There are many, many systems. However, what I'm claiming is that in order for us to have intimacy, there needs to be one such system, right? You need to be in the system. If you're not in a system, you're not going to be able to have it. Okay. So now I want to start talking about a specific system. And actually, it's very, very widespread. And you might think of it as sort of so general that it encompasses a lot of different systems. And I call it the folk system of interpersonal spatiality. And in this system, the phenomenon of nakedness is created. So now we're getting more specific, and I want to start talking about the phenomenon of nakedness. This is where it gets a little weird, but a little bit cool, a little bit fascinating. So we tend to think of clothing, the artifacts that we put on our bodies. Those are clearly cultural. Right? Those are clearly culturally contrived. They're made by us. And so it's very natural to think that nakedness is not cultural, that it's natural. And so, you know, when a child is born, they're born, we say, you know, naked. They're born in sort of English, we say their birthday suits, as if nakedness were a kind of clothes, but we say that this is natural. What I want to suggest to you, however, is that nakedness, just like clothedness, is cultural. It's a cultural construction. And moreover, it's a cultural construction that is constructed through one of these systems of interpersonal spatiality, and in particular, the folk system of interpersonal spatiality. So let's just think about this. Nakedness as a social possibility. So we think about nakedness as it happens, sort of like in the real world. There couldn't be nakedness if there were no clothing. If there was no such thing as people being clothed and being clothed most of the time, it wouldn't be possible to be naked in a sense that matters at all, right? If someone is naked in a public space, right, that can cause a moral outcry. It can invoke worries about indecency or privacy violation. So it's a moral phenomenon, and it's a moral phenomenon that is made possible by the cultural practice of clothing ourselves on a systematic basis. Without the practice of clothing ourselves, this socio-moral phenomenon of nakedness would not exist. So I think that's a pretty weird but philosophically interesting idea. Okay. And so when I think about this, I distinguish between two forms of appearance: proper appearance and intimate appearance. And in the folk system of interpersonal spatiality, clothedness is the proper appearance, and nakedness is the intimate appearance. And I want to explain a little bit what I mean by that. You didn't come into this talk thinking about nakedness. You didn't think about clothing at all. When we just interact with people in a context like this, you don't even think about it. Clothing is presumed. Your mind doesn't even go there. It's taken for granted. Okay. So proper appearance is like that. We don't even think about it most of the time, but we can. And when we do think about it, when we think about proper appearance specifically as clothedness, it ends up being standing in contrast to nakedness. And now we're thinking about nakedness. Now we're having an intimate thought, right? Because nakedness itself invokes this. So think about proper appearance as kind of like the standard taken for granted appearance, and intimate appearance as the appearance that becomes relevant in particular moments of intimacy. Okay. Hopefully that's relatively clear. Okay. So I've said this already. I'll just sort of remind you then that both proper and intimate appearance are cultural. We tend to think of the intimate appearance, nakedness, as prior to culture, but it's not. It's every bit as much cultural as is proper appearance. And I see those two things related to each other. They're interconnected, they're dialectically related, they give each other meaning, right? You can't have clothedness without nakedness, you can't have nakedness without clothedness. And together, they constitute the appearances of people in the folk system. Okay. Now, it just so happens that there are two kinds of intimate appearances and two kinds of proper appearances. There's a differentiation in terms of sex, or as I would prefer to call it, moral sex, because I'm talking about a differentiation in boundary structure. So let's go back and think about nakedness again. There's in fact two different kinds of nakedness, male nakedness and female nakedness. And now let me walk you through this to explain the difference. So female nakedness, in terms of boundaries, has a tiered structure, which means that the female can be topless and or bottomless, and both matter morally. So toplessness concerns exposure of nipples, bottomlessness concerns exposure of buttocks and genitalia. So different boundaries. When you talk about male nakedness, by contrast, there are no such boundaries on the top, right? It's completely fine to show nipples, although presumably not in certain contexts, but it's not a moral infringement. It wouldn't be an infringement of decency or privacy in the way that it would for female toplessness. This is what I mean when I say that there are two different kinds of nakedness. And there are other really fascinating complexities. For example, all things being equal, if we imagine a male seeing a female naked, we imagine that she would consider herself the violated one, she would cover herself. However, if a man were to show himself to a woman and he was naked, she would cover her eyes, right? And we would view this again an infringement against her. In this case, not a violation of privacy, but an offense of decency. So it's interesting then that there are interactive differences between these different forms of nakedness. Okay. Similarly, there are differential forms of proper appearance. So we discern the difference, right, between male and female proper appearance just on the basis of how it looks. And as an aside, it tends to be the case that all things being equal, female proper appearance involves more bodily exposure than does male proper appearance. So for instance, right, you're going to maybe see more shoulders, you're going to see ankles, calves, thighs, right, in female proper appearance that you would not in the same way see with male proper appearance. Okay. So now this brings us back to reality enforcement and this thing that I threw at you last time. I said, look, the reason that trans people are viewed as really, male disguised as female or really female disguised as male is because we live in a system in which gender presentation communicates or represents genital status. Now I have a more formal theoretical way of saying the same thing. What I want to suggest is that male proper appearance communicates male intimate appearance, and conversely, female proper appearance communicates or represents female intimate appearance. And so this sets up the conditions whereby every single one of us are forced to disclose the intimate structures of our body all the time through proper appearance. And it's the reason why trans people in this system are viewed as deceptive, because we're taken to misalign proper and intimate appearance. So if you have a so-called misalignment between, say, male proper appearance and female intimate appearance, what's taken for female intimate appearance, then this is going to be viewed as a deception because it's the proper appearance is taken to communicate something that is in fact not there, something else is. So hopefully that went down okay. Hopefully you have some questions about it. This is kind of the framework that I'm working with. And now I want to take up two of the leading views or theories that I was acquainted with when I came out and transitioned. And the first one, I'm sure many people are familiar with. It's this view that transsexuals specifically, trans people, I guess, are trapped in the wrong body. So you hear this story of someone saying, oh, I'm really a woman, but I was born in the body of a man. Or I'm really a man, but I was born in the, right? And then the idea is, oh, well, we transition to make ourselves feel better, so that we're no longer trapped in the wrong body, so that gender dysphoria is eased, right? Now, this is an account that is not a theory of politics. It's not a theory of trans oppression and resistance. But what it is in part, it is a theory of transgender dysphoria. It explains the sort of discomfort that leads us to transition. And specifically what it's saying is, okay, there's an incongruence between this internal sense of myself and the external material body. So I go and I change and I get hormones and various surgical procedures to bring the external body into alignment with this internal sense of self. Okay, there are many versions of the wrong body account, but the one that I'm interested in talking about a little bit is one that says this internal sense of yourself, this internal sense of your body is innate. You're born that way. You're born with this internal sense of yourself as female, even though you have a male body, and conversely. And one of the reasons why this appeal to the internal sense being innate is important is because the theory is then used by trans people to justify, to validate their gender identity claims. You say, look, I'm really a woman because my sense of womanness is innate. Look, I'm really male because my sense of maleness is inborn. Okay, now, I actually don't think that works. I don't think that the attempt to justify things in that way works. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole with you today. My own view is that trans people shouldn't have to justify our identities anyway, at least that's part of my view. But what I want to say is I see this view as problematic because it focuses only on the body. It focuses only on what I would call intimate appearance. It doesn't focus on proper appearance. And it needs to focus on the body that is taken as natural in order for it to claim that this internal sense of oneself is innate. Because if you start talking about cultural appearance, if you start talking about clothing and the like, right, an internal sense of what sorts of clothes you wear cannot possibly be inborn, right? Because in some cultures, they don't even have clothing. At least not the way we think of it. It can't be innate. Now, in my experiences in Los Angeles, and I talk locally, right? This whole idea of the medical transsexual who changes her body because of this innate sense of her body was blown out of the water. I know so many trans men and women who see themselves as men and women, but don't change their bodies. Or if they do change their bodies only a little bit. What's more important to them is their proper appearance. What they feel dysphoria about is their proper appearance. And so I want to say there's something gone wrong with this account of trans dysphoria, because it requires that we focus on the body alone. And actually, it's not requiring that we focus on the body alone. It's requiring that we focus on intimate appearance alone. Because if you think about those medical procedures that trans folks avail themselves, a great many of them, not all, but a great many of them are precisely ones designed to change the private parts, the parts of the body that are subject to boundaries on access. So for example, breast augmentation, genital reconstruction surgery, all of these types of things are de facto changes in one's intimate appearance. And what I'm wanting to say is we need to move past just to focus on intimate appearance to a focus on intimate and proper appearance. Once we do that, however, we cannot think of this internal sense of self as innate, because this is all cultural. We have to think of it in a different way. Now, I'm not going to go on this any further because I could talk a lot more about this. It invites the question, well, then what causes the dysphoria? I have my views, and you might want to ask me about it during the Q&A. Suffice it to say that I think about dysphoria in terms of the relationship between trans oppression and trans resistance, and that I see trans dysphoria as a form of resistance to an oppressive system. Okay. So now I want to go on to a more expressly political view. This is a theory of trans oppression. This came out, for me, I became familiar with this. It just got really started in the 90s. I was young in transition then. And it was a theory of like why trans people or how trans people are oppressed. And it was a theory that says, look, the problem is we live in a culture that forces on us binary oppositions, a binary opposition between man and woman, a binary opposition between masculine and feminine, and a binary opposition between male and female. And the problem, it said, is that trans people are outside of the binary. Because trans people are outside of the binary, because we're beyond the binary, we end up getting oppressed by a system that says it's got to be the binary. You have to be one or the other, and you can't be both, and you can't be in between, and you can't move from one to the other. That was the theory of oppression, and I think it's still very much accepted today. In fact, I think it's so accepted that the very idea of suggesting this is not a good account of trans oppression will leave people perplexed. But I don't think that it is, or I don't think that it's adequate. And I want to explain to you a little bit why. First of all, I think that it engages in its own form of misgendering. So, I see myself as a woman. I don't see myself as outside the binary. I don't see myself as in between. I see myself as a woman, albeit a trans woman. I'm not the only trans person who feels this way. But if this account of oppression is right, then I'm wrong. I'm confused because trans people are oppressed because we're outside the binary. We're beyond the binary, and the imposition of the binary is the problem, right? So to me, misgendering is the problem. And any theory of oppression and resistance that misgenders trans people can't be a good theory. Okay. I also don't think that this theory is equipped to explain the phenomenon of reality enforcement. I don't think it's adequate. I think we need something more. Let me explain. So there are actually different versions of the beyond the binary account. I'm going to run through a few of them. One says, you know, look, there's these two categories, right? Man and woman. And if you are in neither of those categories, if you're in between, right, you're gonna be subject to harassment and discrimination. That doesn't explain situations in which a trans woman is viewed as really a man disguised as a woman. That has nothing to do with being outside the binary. These two oppositions, the reality and the appearance, and both are situated in the binary. The question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we explain this appearance reality contrast? You already know my answer, because there's a representational relationship between proper and intimate appearance. That explains it, right? But just saying that you have two categories that force out the middle, that doesn't explain anything of this sort. Okay. I'm not going to go through all the different variants of the beyond the binary account. There are different versions of it. And if you want to talk about these versions, we can do that during Q&A. The final point I want to make about beyond the binary is that not only does it fail to account for reality enforcement, it falls prey to it. It falls prey to it by sort of succumbing to the pretender side. Basically, the politics behind beyond the binary says trans people should come out. We should admit who we are. We should speak our truth. We should declare it. After all, how do you generate a political vision unless you do that? Okay. The problem is when you do that, as I've shown, right, you end up being viewed as a pretender or make-believer. The best case scenario is that it looks like people are accepting you. It looks like people are accepting you. If what I said was right at the beginning of this talk about relational foreclosure, right, this fact that later on down the road you're viewed as going too far, right? This is going to suggest that what seemed like acceptance wasn't really acceptance at all. So for these reasons, for misgendering, because it cannot explain reality enforcement, and because it falls prey to reality enforcement by endorsing the pretender side of the double bind, I don't think beyond the binary is an adequate account of trans oppression. Now, I want to be clear. I think it's part of it. I think it's true that especially non-binary folk are oppressed by a binary. That's right. I think that even like some trans people in various different ways are oppressed by a binary. I think lots of folks are. But what I'm wanting to suggest to you is that that's not enough. We need a deeper account of oppression. We need an account that goes beyond that. And I think that by thinking about the relationship between proper and intimate appearance, the communicative relationship, right, we're at least going some distance to understanding at least the phenomenon of reality enforcement. Okay. So in the last part of this talk, what I'd like to do is I'd like to put the theories I've been spinning into a conversation with decolonial feminist theory. Now, the person who basically single-handedly created decolonial feminist theory was Maria Lugones. And I'm very influenced by her work, and I draw upon it a lot. And I want to take you through sort of basic ideas in some of her work, in the sort of like her views about what she calls the coloniality of gender. And so I put up a quote here. Beginning with the colonization of the Americas and the Caribbean, a hierarchical dichotomous distinction between human and non-human was imposed on the colonized in the service of Western man. It was accompanied by other dichotomous hierarchical distinctions, among them that between men and women. This distinction became a mark of the human and a mark of civilization. Only the civilized are men or women. Indigenous peoples of the Americas and enslaved Africans were classified as not human in species, as animals uncontrollably sexual and wild. So let me unpack this a little bit. Her theories are in some ways quite complicated, but in other ways, I think we can get at some of the main ideas with ease. So according to Lugones, right, there was this system of gender that was imposed by the Europeans on everyone else. So here's one problem, right? You have this system of gender being forced on everyone else, destroying everyone else's way of life or attempting to destroy their way of life, disrupting it, and attempting to bring them into this gendered way of life. That's part of it. But importantly, she says that there was a light side and a dark side of gender. By this, she means, right, that it's not like when this system of gender was imposed on Indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans, that they were just brought into the gender system. No, they were positioned differently with regard to the gender system. In particular, right, they were viewed as beasts, like not men quite, not women quite, sexually promiscuous savages, that type of thing. And what Lugones is saying is, so like, that is the way in which Indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans were positioned as non-human, or at least pre-civilized, was by being positioned as being kind of outside of gender or pre-gender. Gender was the sign of civilization. It's an interesting move that she's making here, because she's wedding together the idea of, on the one hand, this distinction between civilization, cultural advancement, and the savage, right? That was clearly present, right, in the colonial ideology. But she's linking it to gender. She's saying the ways in which folks were viewed as savages were specifically in terms of gender, right? Position prior to gender, and ways to be civilized, were to be civilized as either a man or a woman. Okay. Wasn't quite as clear as I've been hoping on that, but maybe it will come a bit clearer. One of the things that I want to just sort of throw out there, Lugones was critical of transgender theory in politics. You can see why she would easily be not friendly to either the wrong body account or the beyond the binary account, and I'll sort of explain it, sort of go through. The problem with the wrong body account is it relies on this binary. It says, yes, you're either, a woman trapped inside the body of a man, or you're a man trapped inside the body of a woman. She wants to say these categories, man and woman, right? Well, they're a cultural, colonial imposition that are part of the coloniality of gender. So here, the wrong body theory is just playing with that stuff, endorsing it and taking it for granted. But we got to understand how this stuff was imposed on everybody else. She's also going to be worried about the beyond the binary account, because she's going to say, oh yeah, that's great, it's true. You want to talk about and people who talk about, the binary being bad will talk about how, a binary system was through Europe imposed on other people, right? That point is made. But what Lugones is going to say, in part, is that you're leaving out an important thing, right? Only white people were truly viewed as binary, right? What ends up happening is anyone who is Indigenous American or who is African is not viewed that way, right? They're viewed as pre-civilized. They're viewed as not sharply differentiated. They're viewed as not strictly conforming to heterosexual norms. Women aren't highly feminine. On the contrary, they're sexually active and aggressive and all this type of racist stuff. So what she's going to say is that by just focusing on the binary as the enemy, you're missing the whole racial, racist underpinning to the whole ideology. So I want to suggest that where I'm going with things in terms of the proper and intimate appearance as a system of intimacy can make good friends with Lugones's direction of thought. Because one of the things that was clearly imposed on people during colonization was sort of this proper appearance, intimate appearance thing. Right? So here's a quote from Irene Watson, an Aboriginal scholar from Australia, right? So the Aborigines did not wear clothing. And if you read this, I'll read this through with you. The colonizer, the bringer of cloth to Australia through the use of force, rape, and violence, dragged us into their world of dress and the covering of the naked body. By forcing the ancestors to be other than who they were, the colonizers did not apply law. Instead, they imposed theft and tyranny upon the indigenous law, its lands and peoples. As we are forced out of nakedness, we moved away from living raw in the law. My interpretation of this is that, however it was that the indigenous folks were living prior to Western colonialism, right? They didn't have nakedness in the way that Europeans had nakedness. This was something that was introduced. Clothing was introduced. Proper, there, what we would call nakedness was proper appearance. But through colonization, a particular system is introduced whereby clothedness is proper appearance and nakedness is intimate appearance. Not only then do we have this sort of system, which, as I've argued, is a system of gender imposed on other people, you also have the racist underpinnings in exactly the way that Lugones was thinking. So first of all, it's very clear ways in which clothedness has been associated with cultural advancement, and nakedness is associated with beastliness. And it's worth noting that this is the very first thing that Christopher Columbus noted in his journals or in his first trip, was he commented on what he perceived to be the nakedness of the indigenous folk, right? And as an aside, it seems that Europeans viewed any system of adornment or what have you that wasn't their own as nakedness. So you have this association with cultural advancement and beastliness. But I also want to suggest that this gets more specific when we think of it in terms of gender. And I want to go back to something I was talking about last time. You know, in my experience working with LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, when we were worrying about how trans people were going to be searched by police officers, we were worried about where trans folks were going to be housed. There were a lot of concerns around trans women violating or raping non-trans women, really, really quite absurd concerns. But it seemed to me that the motivation, the hidden rationale for sex segregation was precisely to protect non-trans females from getting raped or violated. It seems to me similarly that, and there's actually interesting historical documents that suggest this, that when we think about female clothedness, we think of it in terms of rape prevention. I mean, just think about ways in which, right, this is the blaming the victim rhetoric of rape, where you get someone who says, oh, look, she showed up, she was all provocative, she was showing so much skin, she wasn't wearing enough clothing, no wonder she got raped. The guy saw her, got all aroused and couldn't control himself, and so raped her, right? So this is misogynist rape excusing rhetoric. However, note that what it does is it posits a natural male desire, a powerful male sexual desire to have sex, and it views the female body as capable of stimulating that desire, and it views clothing as a kind of form, a kind of way of preventing this rape. Okay, so, but now think about this precisely in terms of the sort of racist representations, the gendered racist representations that we get of Indigenous Americans and enslaved Africans, when viewed as animal-like, is precisely as either one being rapists, animal rapists, or two being a female who doesn't really care whether or not she's raped, highly sexually aggressive and unconcerned for any sort of modesty. What we're getting here are some very specific racist tropes that are deeply connected, I would argue, to clothing and nakedness. And we see how it's very much connected to cultural advancement. My point is, I think that there's a way in which the theory that I'm developing sits nicely with dialogues with the kind of decolonial feminism that Lugones is trying to develop. I'm going to stop with this quote, and this is cited in Deborah Miranda's article, The Exterminations of the Hoyas. And it's actually from Father Palou's book, and anyway, I'll just read it out. Among the Indian women who always worked separately and without mixing with the men, there was one who, by the dress, which was decorously worn, and by the heathen headdress and ornaments displayed, as well as the manner of working, sitting, etc., had all the appearances of a woman, but judging by the face and the absence of breasts, though old enough for that, they concluded that he must be a man, but that he passed himself always for a woman and always went with them and not the men. Taking off his aprons, they found he was more ashamed than if he had really been a woman. I submit to you, this is just reality enforcement. However, it's reality enforcement understood in a colonial context, which is where it ought to be understood. Because what's happening here is it's not as if this person, and I'll say person because I don't know how they identified. It's not as if, right, they saw themselves as part of this European system, but they're brought into this European system of proper appearance represents intimate appearance. And now suddenly they're viewed as really a man. Were they really a man? I don't know. Is that how they were categorizing, right, themselves? I don't know. But the categories imposed here are European ones. So you see clearly the attempt to destroy a pre-existing system of interpersonal spatiality and see it replaced by a new one, the folk one. But you also see ways in which this person who's being sort of forced into this system, into this European system, is never going to get a fair break, is never going to be really viewed as properly legitimate, right? Because they're always going to be viewed as pre-cultural, always viewed as capable of some sort of like lack of civilization. And it's interesting, I didn't include this part of the text, but apparently the worries among the missionaries was that this person was among the women, and they were worried that this person was a sexual predator, and that's why they were attired as a woman, and that's why they were with the women. So again, we see this sort of like, you know, this appeal to this worry about sexual violence against women. And here we sort of see this person being forced into what is clearly a very deeply racist mythology. And with that in mind, I'm going to stop and open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Talia. So we're going to start with the Q&A. I'm going to read the first question. So if anyone has another question, please write them on the chat and I will read them out loud. So the first one is from Becca. She says, thank you so much for your presentation. I am working in bioethics side of the discussion and currently thinking of the gender terms in medicine. I am using your account to think about gender data collection. I want to know, what do you think about the questions about gender assigned at birth and sex assigned at birth and the relation of that to reality enforcement?
That's a good question. I appreciate that. I think it's better than reality enforcement because you're not saying, right, that the person is really male or really female. You're identifying what happened to them culturally. So you're making it about the culture rather than about them. And so I actually think that on the face of it evades concerns about reality enforcement. That said, when you're collecting data and you ask someone to identify, and they're identifying in ways as assigned, you know, male at birth or assigned female at birth or however, right, there is the risk that this will be used against them, right? And it will be read in a way that becomes a kind of reality enforcement, because someone can take that and go, oh, so you're really a man, or oh, you're really a woman. Moreover, that information does provide a way of letting folks know, or at least make decent inferences about what the person's, at least their original genital status was. So it provides that kind of personal information through the veil of a euphemism. I hope this gets at what you're asking about. It's a good question.
If you have a follow-up or comment after Professor Bettcher responds to your question, you can also put it on the chat and I will read it back. We have a question from Katie. Katie says, thank you so much, Professor Bettcher. I would love to hear more about how you understand gender dysphoria.
Okay, well, so first of all, thank you for that. I'm currently working out the details of it. But let me say this. I actually don't accept the incongruence account at all. So it's not like I say we got to include proper appearance in addition to intimate appearance. I think that the idea of an incongruence goes wrong. What I would rather do is understand. So if I were going to unfold all of my theories of interpersonal spatiality, I would also talk about what I like to call interpersonal sentiments that connect to these boundaries. So think about it. When you open yourself to another, when you make yourself available to another, you feel vulnerable. Sometimes vulnerability is good, right? When you choose it. Sometimes it's bad when it's forced, or sometimes it starts off good. You're vulnerable, but a person laughs at you, they shame you, right? Now it's bad, right? So I think that there are a lot of complicated sentiments of this sort that vulnerability, various different forms, and contrasts with vulnerability. I would say like dignity or a sense of self-containment, and you kind of like don't feel vulnerable expressly, right? For me, it's very different whether I put on my boots or I put on my sandals, right? My sandals make me feel a little bit vulnerable. My boots make me feel like, I'm concealing my vulnerability. Well, these feelings, I think, are natural affects to think about when thinking about gender dysphoria and thinking about the relationship, right? Thinking about feelings you might have about your proper and your intimate appearance. Because those are exactly the kind of sentiments we would be expected to have about those sorts of things, right? So then think about ways in which sort of like the way you respond to things in mainstream culture isn't the way you're supposed to be responding to it, right? You're having maybe a sense of vulnerability when you're not supposed to, right? And maybe you're having sort of like a sense of like a complete incapacity to experience vulnerability when you want to, right? So that's sort of the rudiments of understanding dysphoria. But that's very broad. I think you need to get far more specific. And sort of to go back to, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to reduce myself to babbling. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Katie says thank you. And I also wanted to read that Becca says, yes, exactly, thank you very much. I was thinking that even sex is a social construct, or so it might get your notion of reality enforcement. So we have a question, but I want to ask you something before we go to Manuel's questions, because I want to push you a little bit on gender dysphoria, because specifically in terms of children, right? Because so before, when you talked about dysphoria, you said that it's a form of resistance to the oppressive system, right? And you said you can push me on that in a Q&A. And so I was, I was wondering, like, how do you understand that in terms of gender dysphoria in children?
I don't know. I mean, I might have to qualify that. It depends how old the children are, right? I'm prepared to admit there may be cases in which there doesn't need to be any resistance involved. It's just simply about, right? If we go back and think about sort of interpersonal sentiments in terms of sort of like what feels right for me and what doesn't feel right for me, could just be that much. However, I will point out that from a very early age, right, we have children in clothing. Very early age, we're subjecting them to boundaries, and from a very early age, they're learning about boundaries. Very early age. From a very early age, right, they can experience like shame or all types of things like that. And I mean, there can be abuses and things like that too, right? What I'm trying to suggest then is that I don't think that children are exempt from those sorts of things, right? And if we allow for that, then I think that those can be a form of resistance to an oppressive system.
Oh, okay, but like it wouldn't be because of their actions. It would be because of how we interpret their actions, right?
Well, it could be like, to me, resistance is if you do something to someone, right, that harms them,
Right.
makes them feel bad, they push back.
Right.
And primarily, this is going to start with a resistant affect,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sometimes that's all we have because we don't have the power to do anything else. Like, I'm gonna say it crudely. Like, if someone like hurts you and you quietly think to yourself, "Fuck you," like, that's resistant in a certain sense, right? At least you did something, to claim your dignity. So, if we agree that the entire system of gender in the folk system is oppressive, then why wouldn't there just start being like resistant affect to it as soon as the child could start forming relevant interpersonal sentiments? As soon as, I mean, it's not as if, I mean, it's true, we protect children from like sexual intimacy, hopefully, until much older. But this idea of boundaries and where it's okay to look and be looked at and touched by whom, that happens really early.
Right.
So those are two possible moves I could make. Are you
Yeah.
convinced or no?
No, I think it's pretty interesting, and well, I think this gives a lot, to follow in another discussion maybe. But like I was thinking, like, so when they're really young, maybe like the next question that someone would say is like, okay, but what makes one child that's like 8 years old or 6 years old to experience this dysphoria instead of another child? Like,
well, 6 years is like a lot. I thought you were thinking younger. 6 years that's a lot of water. I mean, that's
really?
like, oh yeah. Oh my gosh.
Because I have nephews
I mean,
that are,
they've been potty trained already,
yeah,
right? You're
right,
dealing with boundaries galore. So you want to say what causes? No, I'm not going to be able to like. I mean, so okay, so my account is not going to be. I can give you the exact algorithm that determines what exactly is going to happen, because I think that these things are very subtle, but I think it's all I need to do is sort of develop a general theory and say, like, look, I think that and I can allow that the body is going to be involved. It's not that the body is not going to be involved. We can have particular dispositions to behave in certain ways, but what I don't think is that there's going to be an internal sense of one's gender that is innate, because that requires that gender be universal, and it's not, in my view.
all right.
It's
Okay.
culturally relative, right? What might be universal, if I'm right, is vulnerability, dignity, interpersonal spatiality. In which case, maybe propensities to being more vulnerable might be innate, when there's nothing inherently gendered about it.
Right.
Right. So I'm not saying that the body needn't contribute to it. All I'm saying is I'm against the idea that there's an innate gender.
Right.
Gender.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great. Thank you for pushing me.
Yeah, because I was thinking, like, I have these nephews that are 9, and so their mother is a primary school teacher, and sometimes we discuss this because she's had like 2 cases of children that are experiencing dysphoria, and like, so I was thinking about different stories that I've heard, and like that's why I wanted to push you a little bit on that.
Yeah. I think that the age of like 8 and 9 is like, by then, oh yeah. I mean, I think it's more interesting if you roll it back really early, like you're talking 3 or 4. Then it becomes a bit more challenging on my account, I think.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I was like, the first case that she shared with me was like someone that was like between 4 and 5, and then the other case that she shared was someone that was 9. So, but yeah, it's really helpful. So thank you. So now I'm gonna read Manuel Abelardo's question. So he says, from Lugones' point of view, he's asking, right? To be trans would be to be one more gender, wouldn't it? Oh, okay. So he wants to know if, from Maria Lugones' point of view, being trans would be like a third gender or like another gender. And then he says, however, how would this modify the capitalist sex gender system?
So first of all, what Lugones is going to say is that, like, so if you look at, say, Indigenous Americans, right, where it seems like there's a third gender. So take the case of sort of like De Hoya individual in the concluding quote, right? These folks get described as third gender. What I believe Lugones is going to say is, what makes you think that's gender going on? We're describing it as gender. We're framing it a particular way. But she's going to say, when I'm talking about gender, I mean sort of like what is coming out of the Euro-centered model, right? I don't think that she's going to call that anything. If she calls it gender, it will be a gender in quotes. It wouldn't be like a gender per se, right? What she would say is, however, what's going to happen is, right, a particular way of life is going to be sort of either attempted, eradicated, and then viewed from a Euro-centered viewpoint, in which it's going to be understood as gender deviant behavior or sexually deviant behavior, right? And then there's going to be an attempt to repair or to sort of like bring these folks up to speed so they're doing it right. But there's also always going to be this thought that because they're not Europeans, they'll never do it right. They'll never be up to snuff.
Right, thank you. So now we have Gloria Montserrat. So she's, okay, so she has sort of a comment that she wants to make. So she says, how interesting your proposal. It makes me reflect a lot. And it seems to me that from that perspective, anyone who does not adapt to the dichotomous and hierarchical gender system could live the trans experience, even as racially crossed cis woman. Yeah, okay, yeah. Why, we are not considered as women in the racialization and bestialization. We will also be perceived as imposters. What does not fit in the hegemonic ontology ends up feminizing any other body. I'm not sure. I
don't get the last part, but I will say, I mean, it's really, I appreciate that. I think that the comment is very rich. I do think that there are some differences worth exploring, though, right? Because yes, viewed as not real women or viewed as pre-women, if you will, but there's an expectation, sort of a normative expectation, that they be women. They try to be women. That they should fit in, but it's just like they're gonna keep failing, right? Whereas I think that in the case of trans, it's like, you shouldn't be doing this, right? You're a man, don't do this. I mean, there's almost a kind of like, in this type of like, and it's sort of like in a lot of formulations of like racism, there tends to be this kind of oxymoron. Fit in, be one of us, but you'll never be one of us, really. Fit in, be just like us, but you'll always kind of be inadequate, right? And I think that feature is important to sort of like, and it's an important characteristic of racism that is not always present in reality enforcement, although it can be in case there's an intermeshing of racism and reality enforcement. Thank you for that.
Thank you. If Gloria, if you have something else to say, you can also put it on the chat and I will read it out loud. So I wanted to ask you something else. and, while other people write their questions. So I wanted to ask you about the coloniality of gender and your account. So let's say when you talk about your account and the difference between proper appearance and intimate appearance, right? I was thinking like in ways that we can resist that model, like, like the way you dress is the proper presentation of the intimate appearance, right? So I was wondering, like, where does the queer movement come into your theory? Because if I get this right, part of being queer, or like at least like part of the queer movement, is to, not present themselves as women or men would. So, it's sort of, so like your intimate appearance wouldn't be obvious because your proper appearance is disruptive. If
this is good, and I appreciate this question. I want to be careful. I think that what's important, the way that I would understand this, is in terms of alternative worlds, to use Lugonos's terms, or in terms of alternative systems of interpersonal spatiality, to use my own expression. I think that what you see in queer communities, in queer cultures, are different ways of doing intimacy. And I would say that in certainly the queer spaces that are trans spaces, right? The system, the dominant system, is already broken. It's already subverted. Right? There's no need for, like, I mean, just like in the, in the trans worlds that I'm familiar with, in our system of interpersonal spatiality, you see someone's proper appearance, that tells you nothing about their intimate appearance, nothing at all. You're entitled, and that doesn't make them a liar. It doesn't make them anything. That's their proper appearance, right? You want to know about their intimate appearance? Well, maybe you should get intimate with them. That will come, and that's a different way of doing intimacy. So, I mean, I would say yes. I think that is so in various forms of queer culture.
Yeah, I was thinking about it as a sort of mechanism in mainstream culture.
I think, though, here's maybe going to come in the difference between gender expression and gender presentation again, unfortunately. Because if you think about, like, if what you have in mind by queer folks and sort of queer, I think that you're thinking about gender expression. So you think of sort of like a woman who presents really masculinely, or a man who presents really femininely, right? Okay.
Or maybe not necessarily, like maybe like people that are more like androgynous, maybe.
Okay, right. But for me though, because I'm focused on gender presentation,
okay,
in the case of the masculine woman, she still reads as a woman.
Right.
And we still conclude that she has a particular intimate appearance from that. The guy may be feminine, but we still conclude he's a guy, and from the male proper appearance conclude he has a particular intimate appearance. The more interesting case is not merely androgynous, but it's when you look at the person and you don't know, you genuinely don't know, right? And that is, I mean, I wouldn't call that, you're going to get subject to a form of harassment that is not the same as reality enforcement, but is a close cousin of it. What you're going to get is, right, what are you? What are you? What are you?
Right.
And this is going to be connected to inquiries about what's between your legs, and maybe subject to brutal genital verification and probably violence, right? So here, you're not being held accountable for lying. You're being held accountable for not saying anything, for not providing any information, false or true, right? And I suppose you can look at that as a form of resistance, but all that's going to happen in mainstream culture is these people are going to be harassed and tortured.
Right.
If you want proper resistance, I think that you need an alternative system.
Yeah,
Does
so
that
the
help?
question would be like how to, change the system.
Well, I have a different question. This gets into like the politics, and here also I'm very much influenced by Luana's. I mean, I understand the pragmatics of it. We spend so much of our time thinking about how are we going to change the mainstream? How am I going to convince that transphobe to love me and be nice to me? How am I going to convince those people to stop, right? And I have a very, very pessimistic view. I don't know that it can be done. Because I think that in order to change transphobia, you need to change homophobia, you need to change sexism, you need to change racism, you need to completely decolonize the entire system. And that's not going to happen anytime soon. I'm much more of a fan of building coalitions with other people who are also being harassed and oppressed. Because I think that if we start making friends under the radar, there's more of us than there is of them. Right? I think that the direct assault, I'm going to try to make you change your mind, I'm going to try to make you change the system. I don't know, I'm pessimistic.
Thank you. Yeah, I think my mood changes with the news and the yeah, so let me see. Okay, so I have a question, but it's not on here. Okay, so this question is from Eduardo. And so he asks, nakedness is certainly socially constructed. Could you elaborate more on what you mean by nakedness as moral?
Thank you for that question. So I want to go back to this idea of interpersonal spatiality and this idea of boundaries. So we think that these boundaries set up a situation in which it's okay to cross them and in which it's not okay to cross them. So there's violations. So I think that this is a moral notion. So I understand nakedness as structured by boundaries, as a boundary structure, right? So if you think about the difference between male and female nakedness, to go back to that, female nakedness, there's a tiered structure. You have boundaries on nipples, right? Boundaries on toplessness, boundaries on bottomlessness. So yes, socially constructed, but also moral because we're dealing with moral boundaries.
Right, thank you. Everyone that has asked a question, if you want to say something else, a follow-up or
These are all great questions, by the way. Really good questions.
You can put them on the chat and I will read them out loud. So I wanted to do a follow-up on this question about nakedness, because there are certain cultures where, like you've said before, like being naked is like part of the culture, like, I don't know, for instance, in the tropical rainforest in Peru, right? Mm-hmm. So would you say that the system, like the colonial system and the construction of nakedness encourages sexual violence? Like, would you say that?
Yes, I would say that. I would say, and I didn't develop the point here, but I would say that the colonial system eroticizes sexual violence.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
I think that it eroticizes giving people boundaries and then violating them. I mean, that's kind of, I mean, I think that if you think about the treatment, I'm not the first one to think of, to sort of put the point, but I'm putting the point in terms of my own theory, right? I mean, so in the US, you have naked Black men and women on the auction block, right? You have white male slave owners who, right, feel that they can rape enslaved Black females with impunity, right? What is the eroticism that is underlying that? What is the erotic content, right? And I would suggest that what's underlying it is sort of this desire to violate, to expose, to sort of say, here are your boundaries. I'm going to strip you naked in front of everyone. And I can't do more than that. I can't say more than that right now. I don't think that I can develop it very well. But yes, I mean, there's this idea that I think Horton Spillers develops called pornotroping, right? But I mean, this idea of eroticizing the indigenous American or enslaved African as sort of like pre-civilized, as having no boundaries, as having boundaries and yet not having boundaries, or being prior to boundaries. I think that's all part of it. And I'm sorry, I know that I'm kind of rambling. I'm not being as fair as I could be.
No, that's good. It's helpful. I was just thinking, because so sometimes I get the impression when we, discuss decolonial theory, like the like the sexism and the violence comes with this system of women, men, that it's imposed by the colonial system, right? Mm. But like, would you say that before that there would also be a system that's not maybe based on women and men, but like also categorizes, certain bodies in certain ways that promote?
Yeah, for sure. And it could be violent, it could be bad.
That would promote a violent.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying the only bad system is like the colonial system. There could be other violent systems too. I don't know. There could be. It's just that the colonial system has had such a global influence.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was just curious. So yeah. I wanted to suggest maybe because we still have some time, and I know a lot of people are really interested in the part of sex work. If you would, if you think it would be a good idea to like go back to the sex work part of the presentation.
Okay, I can try to. I guess because we have no questions, huh?
No, but like last time, there were so many people that were really interested in like the sex work part of the presentation. So I think
I'm very happy to.
Yeah, I think really helpful.
And I think that it follows. So one of the things, I'm just going to go over these slides again, but let me sort of preface it by saying, I was talking to Aranza afterwards, and it was sort of funny because she was sharing sort of attitudes in Peru, and how prostitution was here in Peru, and I was thinking about it from my US perspective. And it's funny because in the US now, like in trans political circles and feminist circles, you need to say sex work. You shouldn't say prostitution. And you should be pro-sex work. You should be like, no, it should be work just like anything else. And so I'm always very careful because I actually don't feel that great about it. I have more negative views that I sometimes like need to keep to myself. And so the funny thing is that when I was talking about it last time, I was doing that. But, as Aranza was explaining to me, it's sort of like there's more of a tendency, in Peru to say like, no, this is not okay. Prostitution is not okay, right? It's not something that should be welcomed. And so I found that interesting. So, I mean, I feel a little bit more free to, sort of speak my mind in light of that. So let me just sort of like preface this by sort of going back to the coloniality of gender. So Maria Lugones draws on the work of Aníbal Quijano, who developed a lot of the stuff on coloniality and coloniality of power. And one of the things that he talks about is that, so when you don't think about, racist colonization, right? When we think of economics, we just think about things like wage labor. But, he says that when you think about sort of like, labor and economics from both the light and the dark side, then you don't just think about like wage labor, you think about, right, enslavement, and you think about, servitude, and you think about all sorts of other things in which labor is exploited or extorted out of people. It doesn't fit the sort of job model at all. And so I'm inclined to think that I think that prostitution or sex work in general is too broad to speak on, but I do think that trans sex work or trans prostitution specifically, that it can be argued, right, that it's very much of this type, that it's very much exploited labor that doesn't necessarily fall within the auspices of sort of like just any other sort of work. So more like, sexual violence with the compensation of some, with some money or some food or some drugs. And what I was interested in sort of thinking about last time is ways in which this is set up to form a complete system. Like things tend to work together, even when it seems like they're working apart. Right, so I was talking about, like, first of all, you need to think about supply, right? Where do we get the labor from? And the demand, who's demanding it? What is being demanded? What is the service, if you will, that's being provided, or what is the commodity? And so certainly I talked about ways in which supply is generated through various forms of reality enforcement, certainly. So being kicked out of your family because you're a man who likes to dress like a girl, not being able to find any kind of decent work at all because you're trans, not being able to achieve educational opportunities, all these types of things, right, are shaped by trans oppression. But then, as we were talking about it last time with the intermeshing of oppressions, shaped also by racist oppression and other forms of oppression. One of the ways in which supply is maintained, I think, that is distinctive, at least in the US, for trans women, is that in other cases, women, there are programs designed to help women get out of it, to help women find some sort of other way of making money, right? Finding ways to heal, right? But the problem is there are very few programs for trans women. And the reason is these programs for women won't include trans women. And the reason they won't include trans women is because they view trans women as really men who are gonna rape the women, right? The same thing that I keep telling you about. And so what that means is that not only are you generating the supply, you don't have the same right of exit that you do in cases for at least some non-trans women. Okay, so in terms of demands, one of the things that I was talking about last time, I mean, what is being sold, presumably, right, is some sort of erotic experience, right? And in the case of, like, if a trick goes to see a trans woman specifically, to see a trans woman, right, that means that he has a very particular eroticism that he's interested in satisfying, right? Otherwise, he would go to a non-trans woman. So why does he go to the trans woman? What is his eroticism that he needs, right? And there are different fantasies that he may wish to act out. So, for example, he may wish to, part of the eroticism may involve having sex with a man who is feminized. Let me be the fantasy. So you can see that erotic fantasy, from a trans woman's perspective, she doesn't see herself as a man, doesn't see herself as a feminized man. That's going to be an invalidating fantasy. However, she's got no choice. If she's got little options and she needs to make a buck to survive, she's going to turn that trick, right? And that can be an unpleasant experience, you know. I mean, and I have a close friend of mine who, you know, is very, very down on trans prostitution. You know, she had, you know, very negative experiences of this sort. Anyway, there's a lot more erotic fantasies that are very sort of specific. So the idea is that you're going to get a demand, a sexual fantasy or a specific eroticism that concerns trans women, and it's going to involve this further invalidation. Okay. I'll also throw in, now that we've talked about boundaries and interpersonal spatiality and all these things, right? I will say that one of the things that is being contracted for by the trick is the right to access the prostitute's intimate appearance, either visually, with touch, through like sexual conduct, however you want to, you know, put it, that is being contracted for. Now, you might worry, you might say that that is not something that you can make a contract for. But even if you could, I will note that in situations in which trans women are funneled into this, where they have little recourse to anything else, where there's very little other options, right? This is getting very, very close to outright sexual violation, because you have no choice. To survive, you need to let the trick access, you know, your intimate appearance. And it's going to de facto constitute as a kind of violation. Okay. So as I said, it works together as a system. And meanwhile, so you have these forces that are creating the economy, the sex economy, creating the supply and the demand. At the same time, we live in a society in which society tries to force prostitution out, eliminate it. And often these forces that try to eliminate prostitution are not ones who help the prostitute. They're not. They're ones that make life worse for the prostitute. They're not interested in helping her, right? So if you think about sort of moral disapprobation, right? Oh, we don't want prostitutes in our area. It gets even worse. Oh my God, you have homosexual men dressed as women, you know, prostituting themselves on the street. Oh, you know, Calithere, this is morally horrible, right? I mean, that's not helping at all. When you think about ways in which it is overtly criminalized, Aranza was telling me is that even though it's technically legal in Peru, it's legal in only name, that for the most part, like any actual form of prostitution is going to be a criminalized form. You end up with all forms of police harassment. And so minimally you're going to get the police harassment, but you can also then get, you know, incarceration. So then you're also going to be subject to reality enforcement in case you're placed with, as a trans woman, placed with men, placing you at further risk of sexual violence, or if you're subject to various invasive forms of searching, right? Never mind then street violence that you're going to face owing to not only people who hate prostitutes, but those who hate trans women, or rather who view trans women as men dressed as women, as homosexual prostitutes, right, they're going to harass them, right? So I think you know, sorry, in Los Angeles, one of the main drags, and I think that it's still the case for trans women prostitutes is Santa Monica Boulevard. I know that it used to be the case that gang members used to drive by and use water pistols to shoot bleach at the trans women and to shoot urine at them. So it was a form of harassment. So you're going to get, when you're prostituting on the street, you're going to be susceptible to all forms of violence. And, you know, it's going to be worse, or you're going to get that additional kick if you're a trans woman. Okay, and then also, there's this further complication that is, if you're a trans woman and you turn your trick, and then afterwards, your client, your trick, can then turn around and accuse you of tricking him, of saying, oh, I didn't know that was really a man, like that. And subjecting you to violence or subjecting you to all sorts of problems. So I've outlined now a bunch of things that sort of stand in the way of trans prostitution, make life harder for the trans prostitute. But what I'm wanting to say is I don't see the forces that create trans prostitution and the forces that prohibit trans prostitution as opposed to each other, really. I see them as working together. Because if you think about it, right, there's never any real effort to actually get rid of it. Because to actually get rid of it, you'd have to change society, right? You'd have to give trans women real opportunities. You'd have to work to get rid of, you know, various forms of transphobia, including reality enforcement. But that's not what happens. You have the street sweeps that move it down the street, right? There's no, all there is in the end, all of these forces that sort of mitigate against trans prostitution, I would argue, merely serve to destabilize it, destabilize the trans woman who is engaged in prostitution. Because if she isn't stable, if she doesn't have a steady place where she can work, if she's constantly fearing for her life, she'll never be in a position to either leave, or if she stays, you know, build herself up as a kind of entrepreneurial, you know, businesswoman and charge more. So minimally, what I think that these things do, the forces that seem to eliminate prostitution, don't really eliminate it. Rather, they make leaving it even harder, and they make empowerment for the prostitute even less likely.
So we have Rosa Mercedes said on the chat that in Peru, trans people, not trans sex workers, but like trans people, are also raped, are also robbed, and are also abandoned naked in places that are very far away. So I think she wanted to make this comment so you know that this also happens to trans people, not only like sex workers that are trans.
Oh, no, and I agree. And the same is the case in the US, and the same is the case worldwide. And so I don't want to say that this only happens to trans women who are doing sex work or engaged in prostitution. But I will say this, you're more vulnerable, right? If you're forced to be on a street visibly trans every night to survive, right? You don't have any protection, right? You're out in the open in a well-identified area for trans prostitution. You are particularly vulnerable. So, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, sort of, I think that the whole point of, like, you know, the series of talks has been to talk about ways in which trans folks are vulnerable to these things. And I would say all trans folks are to some degree or other. However, I think that when you start to think about the intermeshing of various oppressions, you get systems, right, that create particularly stark precarities, vulnerabilities. And, you know, when talking about trans prostitution, sex work, that's what I'm trying to get at here, to show that to you. But I think that we're in agreement, and I appreciate your point. You're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Rosa. If you want to say something else, you can also put it on the chat. So we have one more question, but I also wanted to mention something very quick that has to do with what Rosa mentioned. So because Peru is a country that, so economically we are poorer, right, than in the States. Mm-hmm. So I think also something that might have to do with what Rosa mentioned is that most people are forced to use public transport or to walk alone at night. And in general, using public transport in general is pretty stressful, because there's a lot of violence that happens there, like for anyone. So like it's even worse if you are part of the LGBTQ, or, you know, if you're trans.
No, point taken. I hear that. I mean, I think that if you're in a poorer country or in a poorer area, right, it's going to be harder for you as a trans person for all of the reasons that you outlined.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Eduardo has a question. So he says, is there empirical evidence that the legalization of trans sex work reduces sexual violence against trans people? It sounds intuitive, but I'm wondering whether there's data on this issue.
I don't know if there's data on it or not. I mean, I think that there's probably someplace data more generally on decriminalizing or legalizing of prostitution in general. There are different, but I would say there are different models of legalization. They're not all the same. So, and there's also different forms of, like, criminalization. I mean, you could just say no laws at all on the books whatsoever and wholly decriminalize. That's going to create one situation. But if you do what I believe to be the case in Peru, right, there's certain people who, like, have a certificate or whatever that allows them to be sex workers. Then you're just going to complete a whole other black market where everything happens over again, and the same vulnerabilities are happening. And so my answer to your question is, I don't know, but I think that there are different forms of legalization, and understanding the different, I think that the different forms would yield different results. That makes sense.
Yeah, and I would add that also the conditions in which it is, you know, like in which it happens, I would say, right? Like if, exactly. I don't know, I mean, maybe this is being too positive, but like if the government would, you know, provide certain conditions, or, yeah, like I don't know, it would happen. But I think that the conditions are also important, because, for instance, some of the trans sex workers that I've interviewed, they only have a small room where they live, and then they take the clients to their room, right? Because they don't have other places in which they can do their sex work. So it becomes more invasive into their lives, right? So that's, you know,
harder to draw personal boundaries.
Right. Yeah. Right. Also, and also when they become violent, right, and you want to keep them out, and like they can come back. So, you know, that's why I was thinking about like the conditions that would be needed in order to, you know, have sex work being legal. Like not only to legalize it, but like give certain conditions. Yeah, I don't know. Like
exactly right. Yeah.
So Rosa wanted to say something else. Oh, okay. So she wanted to share something. So she says that we need to fight for a law, for the gender identity law, but sadly COVID-19 has evidenced the vulnerability and abandonment for part of the government. So the thing in Peru is that there has been a lot of collectives and activists, trans activists that have
It's a really important issue right now.
Yes, it's like I've mentioned before. So
Yeah.
It's a pretty important issue, and they've been fighting and like trying to get the government to have this law that would be the gender identity law for trans people to be able to change their names and their sex in their ID. But because of COVID and many reasons that you can imagine, it's been like pushed away again. So I think Rosa wanted to like just, give a shout out so that people,
You have to fight for it. I mean, this is really important.
Yeah, and we have a question from Madeline Gutierrez. So she wants to know your opinion about the this new right-wing radical, current and this discourse on gender ideology.
What are my views on it? It scares the hell out of me. It's not good. I mean, in the US, the radical right feeds off of sort of very gender reactionary views, but also very, racially reactionary views. And I don't see it going away anytime soon. But it seems like it's all over the place. Like, I don't know. I mean, isn't today the big election in Brazil, or isn't it? It's coming up soon, right? I mean,
yeah, I'm not sure that on the day, but yeah,
but it is coming up, right? I think that Lula is currently leading.
Yeah, I think that's why she asked like your opinion on the growth of this extreme right wing.
I mean, like why it's happening. I don't know why it's happening. I mean, it seems like it's a reaction in part to globalization, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's on Sunday. I just checked the election in Brazil.
And
yeah.
I know they're worried about violence.
Yeah, I guess we're all terrified because it's happening all over.
Is it happening in Peru too? Is there a right-wing resurgence?
Yes. I mean, it's been here forever, but yeah, because so like the last election, we had this candidate that won that was a left wing for everything that had to do with economics. But guess what? Whenever it has to do with social rights, then they agree with the right wings. Yeah, because so in Peru, it's not even legal, the civil union for gay people, for instance. In the national curriculum of education, they wanted to talk about gender equality, and they like the people said that was gonna make their kids become gay, so they prohibited like there's a lot of we have a really conservative government and society in so many areas. So yeah, it's pretty complicated in a country like ours, because even the left wing agrees with the right wing when it comes to social rights.
Wow.
Yeah, so the fact that we are discussing this with you right now is already an improvement.
It's already a form of resistance. It's a form of resistance already.
Exactly. So yeah. So well, it's 8. And so I wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, for your questions, for listening to us, for the ones that have participated in more than one session. It truly means so much to have you with us. And I want to give a special thank you to Professor Bettcher, not only for your incredibly amazing, truly inspiring lectures, but also for being so open and vulnerable with us and sharing your own experience and, sharing your own vulnerability through your presentation and your academic work. It really means a lot, and I know that it means a lot to everyone, not only to myself. So we are really appreciated and thankful.
Thank you. Thank you all. I mean, thank you all for coming and listening and participating, and thank you all for really great questions. Lovely conversation. Thank you.
So I think with this, the UNESCO-PUCP Lectures on Gender Equality 2022 come to an end. So thank you again to everyone. Well, people in the chat are saying thank you very much, great talks, hearts. So yeah, so I just want to say thank you again, and thank you to everyone that's here. Also, thank you for our support from the university that has been helping us with, you know, the Zoom platform, and also thank you for the amazing translators that we've had these past three lectures. Thank you so much to everyone. We will send via email the presentations in a few days, and we will also upload the videos on YouTube, but you can rewatch them on our Facebook fan page if you want.
Oh, I wanted to ask you something, Aron. So would I be able to link to those on our department page?
Yes, of course.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
So, thank you, everyone.